Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Meghan Murphy. Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here again.
It's great to have you on. It's always great to have you on, but especially this week because big things are happening in your country of birth, no longer the country where you live, but your country of birth, Canada, where Justin Trudeau has resigned and it's making headlines around the world. And I want to ask you a bit about Trudeau and his regime and what he got up to for the decade that he was in power. I don't think I need to ask you what you think of Trudeau, because you've written a brilliant Substack piece in which you say, fuck Justin Trudeau forever. So it's pretty clearly laid out. But I guess I'll start by asking you, how do Canadians like you, Canadians who are a bit skeptical, a bit dissenting, your Canadian friends as well, how are you feeling this week with him leaving office and the end of his tenure finally arriving?
Yeah, as you pointed out, I'm not exactly the queen of subtlety. So my piece was quite clear, and I've been pretty clear on my views of Justin Trudeau over the years, which are negative, to say the least. I wish that I was celebrating, but what he's done is so manipulative and so really in kind with his behavior and actions over the past, 4 or 5 years, that we shouldn't be surprised. But it's a thing that I wish I didn't have to clarify. But he hasn't resigned. In his little speech on Monday, he says he intends to resign. He's very good at manipulation. And what he's done actually is he's prorogued Parliament. So he's frozen all parliamentary business. So for the next 2.5 months until March 24th, unless there's a successful legal challenge to his proroguing of Parliament, which there is on the horizon, he can sort of operate with impunity, without parliamentary scrutiny, and without any votes of no confidence, which is exactly what was probably coming this week, which I'm sure he knew. There was very likely to be a vote of no confidence at Parliament, which would mean that he would be forced to resign. So he took the reins, and 2 days before that would have happened, he announced that actually he was intending to resign and was freezing Parliament so that they couldn't do anything about his next 2-month reign of power.
It was really interesting reading your piece, because everything I'd seen up to that point had been quite celebratory. People were waiting with bated breath for him to make this announcement. And the kind of people I know are very Trudeau skeptical, and they were like, at last he's going. Thank God. This is, the end of a terrible nightmare for Canada. But your piece makes the point which you've just alluded to there, which is that actually it was almost like his final snub to the Canadian people, because he deprived Canadians of the chance to vote him out, which, as you say, there would have likely been a vote of no confidence. There would have been an election. He would have lost amazingly in a huge way. But he's kind of robbed Canadians of that opportunity. How important do you think it was that he did that instead of putting himself before the Canadian people, he's kind of scurried away and said, well, I'll just let my administration peter out rather than letting you judge me?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important because there's still a lot of damage that he can do over the next 2.5 months. And also it's symbolic, again, of his reign, of his authoritarianism, and his total lack of respect for the Canadian people and for our charter rights and the democratic process. I mean, what he's done has been to skirt the democratic process completely. He's not the king. And in fact, Parliament has more power in Canada than the government does. It's the job of Parliament to monitor the government, to monitor the prime minister. And what he's done is prevented them from doing its job. So it's quite serious. It's certainly an impediment to the democratic process. And for him to say I've always done, he says this in his speech on Monday, I've always done what's best for Canadians. Everything that he says, everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. This is the opposite of the truth. He's not done what's in the best interest of Canadians, not for many, many years. He's done what's in the best interest of his ego and his power. We saw this when he invoked the Emergencies Act illegally. It was determined that was not legal for him to have invoked the Emergencies Act in 2022 to squash the Freedom Convoy protests. Those are peaceful protests. And the Emergencies Act has never been invoked in all of Canadian history. It's a very serious thing. This would be something that you would do in response to a terrorist attack. And of course, he tried to frame the convoy as terrorists, and that was complete and utter bullshit. Excuse my language. For Americans who want to better understand this, it's essentially the same as invoking martial law. He's curtailing all the charter rights of Canadians. And he used this power to do things like freeze citizens' bank accounts, to persecute innocent Canadians who participated in the protest or supported the protest, and to use violent measures. He brought in the riot horses to trample protesters. And it seems that, the way that he's operating is in defense only of his ego, and for him to be spouting the very opposite kind of narrative is really gross.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned the 2022 when he invoked the Emergencies Act against the protest in truckers, which, as you say, was a peaceful protest. It was an uprising of primarily working class people who didn't want to have to adhere to certain medical measures that were being pushed on them. I thought that was a really important moment in the Trudeau years, because I think it was probably because a lot of people around the world were shocked by what he did then. And I think it was a bit of an eye-opener, because there had long been this contradictory phenomenon where in Canada, there was a lot of healthy skepticism about Trudeau and a lot of opposition to Trudeau. But on the world stage, he was seen as this wonderful, fashionable, handsome liberal who was, the pinnacle of 21st century liberal politics, very nice and woke and friendly. And there was such a contradiction between how my Canadian friends would talk about him and then how people in Britain or Australia or Europe would talk about him. Given that, how do you think he will be remembered? Because I guess which vision of him do you think will win out when we have the discussion about what he did while he was ruling Canada?
I think he'll be remembered as a clown and as an authoritarian. He's really destroyed his reputation globally. And you're right. When he was first elected, people thought of him as this nice, perhaps sort of almost useless. When he was elected, I didn't see him as a threat. I saw him maybe as sort of silly. I thought that I've always thought that male feminists are kind of silly. His insistence that he's gonna, call himself a feminist until it becomes uncontroversial to do so, as if it was controversial for him to call himself a feminist and not totally self-serving. I thought that was silly, of course, but I didn't expect him to be harmful. And I think everyone thought that he was, this really nice kind of progressive guy, almost the perfect representative for Canada. And he turned out to be, the most unpopular prime minister in Canadian history, I think. He's destroyed the reputation not only of himself, but of Canada. I think that Canada has become a laughing stock as a result of Justin Trudeau, as a result of the kind of woke views that he expressed, including, certainly the idea that trans women are women, this very gung-ho approach to the transitioning of kids, and teaching kids about gender identity in schools, and, offering drag shows in libraries for kindergartners and things of that nature. And then what he did during COVID, and what he did to the convoy, which, a lot of Canadians at first supported his attacks on the convoy. A lot of, Canada's a pretty progressive place, and progressive Canadians believed and went along with the narrative that these were dangerous misogynists and racists, white supremacists, Nazis, all these ideas that were fed to us via the media. Canada has a very small media landscape, so you don't really get a lot of diversity, and our algorithms are dictated by Justin Trudeau and the government. So, he was passing laws that ensured that he got to decide what people saw in their Facebook feeds and on YouTube. So it's not totally surprising. It's disappointing that Canadians would have gone along with that, but they did. I think many changed their minds after the convoy, but, I think that around the world, Canadians really weren't aware of how the global view of them was changing, and they became a source of mockery and sort of an example of what other countries don't want to become because of Justin Trudeau.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I want to let you know some exciting news. My new book is out now. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in chilling detail how activists, academics, and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up, in the process, turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now on Amazon.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. And I think the thing that you capture really well in your Substack piece, your Substack, of course, is called The Same Drugs, and everyone should subscribe to it and read it. I love the subheading of it is Conversations Outside the Algorithm, which is a very important thing to have. And in your piece there on Trudeau, you capture really well the iron fist in the velvet glove of wokeness. And that really is what his rule spoke to, the fact that behind this supposedly progressive facade that certain politicians present, there is this ruthless, sometimes quite vindictive authoritarianism that's kind of lurking in this nice politically correct language. And you give a few examples of that where he claims to be liberal and yet he wants to control what people can say on the internet. He claims to be in favor of women's rights and yet he goes along with the trans ideology, which is a serious threat to women's rights. He claims to be, gay friendly, and he's worn gay friendly socks and ties and all that kind of nonsense. And yet he supports, the drugging of young gay kids under the banner of the gender ideology. So you really capture the kind of swirling contradictions of this progressive politics that is actually quite backward. And I did want to ask you about a few of those things and what you think they tell us about Trudeau and I guess about Western liberalism more broadly. So on the trans issue, how much of an issue was that for him, and what kind of ideas and policies did he push, do you think, that were quite destructive of women's rights and gay rights and these other problems that emerge from the gender idea?
Well, he was prime minister when Bill C-16 was passed in 2017. So that was really the beginning of the transanity that we've seen in Canada ever since. That was our gender identity legislation in Canada. And what it did was to incorporate gender identity and gender expression into the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code. And I think that people who were aware that this was coming up the pike didn't understand the full implications of that law, because the law itself was quite vague. You know, it wasn't as though the law spelled out, you have to refer to men who identify as women as female or anything like that. But as soon as that bill passed, it took hold across the provinces and everything changed. And you were no longer allowed to criticize gender identity ideology. It was incorporated into the school curriculum. And this is when we started seeing all this nonsense around men essentially operating with impunity, you know, being allowed to access girls' change rooms, being transferred into women's prisons and things like that. And all of this went unchallenged. And he insisted, like you say, that he was this advocate for women's rights. And he attempts to criticize Trump and Americans in general, but particularly Republicans and the right, for being, you know, misogynist and anti-woman. And by comparison, he's, of course, this big feminist. And he, at the same time, announces that trans women are women constantly and treats these men who identify as women as victims in need of support. He tried to frame essentially anyone who was critical of gender identity ideology, but specifically the people who were trying to organize around protecting kids from gender identity ideology and challenging things like, you know, the policy in schools where kids would be socially transitioned without their parents' knowledge, which means, you know, they would change their names to an opposite sex name and they would change their pronouns. These are minors, right? And they were doing this in school without telling the parents. And so, of course, parents were angry when they discovered this. Parents were also angry to discover that kids were being taught this ideology in the first place, that, you know, oh, maybe this boy is actually a girl because he likes wearing dresses more than he likes wearing pants, or because he likes long hair, or he doesn't want to play with trucks. He wants to play with dolls, all this really sexist, regressive nonsense. And the parents who organized and pushed back, Justin Trudeau and his government, framed as terrorists, as bigots, of course, and as, you know, a danger to so-called LGBTQ plus people, when in reality, you know, as you know, I've been fighting this fight since, you know, 2015, 2016, and I have faced serious danger and threats. And those of us who do speak out, of course, women in particular, face violence. You know, I still, at every event I do, need private security and a police presence just to speak about women's rights and just to say really basic stuff in Canada, like men aren't women. And the tides are turning. The tides are turning in the US. I think that the tides are turning in the UK. And, you know, the general population in Canada is revolting against this ideology. But nonetheless, trans activists have had full reign and full impunity to do whatever they want to those of us who push back. And for him and his government to treat us as the danger and treat us as a terrorist threat while we're getting death threats. And when we can't even speak, you know, I've been part of organizing a number of events in BC over the past couple of years. I was back in the summer and the fall and the spring last year to do some events around this issue, and same thing with the year before. And every time we booked a venue, we lost the venue. And we had to involve lawyers in order to force these venues to allow us to speak freely. You know, it's a total reversal of the truth. And, you know, he seems to think that if he announces that he's going to offer free birth control, you know, free hormonal birth control to women, that makes him a feminist. And that means that people will buy that he's standing for women's rights. And I'm sure some people do buy that, but that's it's total BS. He's a complete and total phony. He's a complete and total narcissist. I think he's a really disgusting person. And I think that's what so many Canadians think about him now. And I think he's a laughing stock around the world.
Yeah. I think that's true. On the trans question, I think what you say is absolutely right, which is I often think to myself, give me a kind of old-fashioned sexist like Trump over a modern-day feminist like Trudeau any day of the week, because, Trump might have said gross things in the past, and he might say rude things about women and their bodies, etc. But someone like Trudeau, who poses as this wonderful anti-Trump feminist, enacts policies and, as you said there, censorship, which has a far more damaging impact on women's lives and women's freedom. And I think when you talk about the experience you've had, I want to ask you a bit about that a bit later on. But, I've seen some of those images where there have been kind of mobs of feral misogynists turning up to protest against your speeches or to protest against the meetings that you're holding. And I often think to myself, this kind of stuff is actually green lit by Justin Trudeau, because when he says it's wrong and problematic and terroristic to criticize the trans ideology, he actually is given a green light to people to protest against women who want to do precisely that, who want to criticize aspects of the trans idea. You say there's been a change of climate in Canada and around the world, and I think there's been a lot more willingness of people to be skeptical of the gender ideology. But how is that playing out in Canada? So is it now more commonplace to hear people criticize people like Justin Trudeau for going along with this ideology, which is quite lunatic when you think about it? Are people more openly criticizing that? Are they coming around to the perspective that you've been pushing for 10 years? How is it playing out in Canada?
Yeah, I was just thrilled to go back to BC the year before last. And BC is a very progressive province. It usually goes to the NDP, which is sort of our version of the Labour Party. It's even left of the Liberal Party. And I just saw, there were trucks everywhere with stickers that said "fuck Trudeau" with the Canadian flags on them, which are symbolic of allyship with the Freedom Convoy. And, all of this pro-trucker signage and bumper stickers and so on and so forth. And I think if you get outside of Vancouver, the urban centers in Victoria, support for Trudeau is nil. And indeed, across Canada, I think his support has gone down to like 16% or something like that. And you can't tell if you look at the media. I don't think that Canadians really get a good sense of what's going on in Canada or around the world, because their vision of what's the truth and what is representative of the Canadian population is dictated by these news organizations and media outlets that are totally biased in favor of Justin Trudeau and against the Conservatives and against the working class and against anyone who dissents from the status quo. But in reality, people hate him. I'm sure that you've seen these videos circulating online. Every time he goes anywhere, people are screaming at him. I've never seen anything like this in Canada before in my entire life. I've never seen such hatred for a politician in Canada, across Canada, than I have for Justin Trudeau. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. But again, the primary reason for that is, and I think this is great and super interesting, but because of what he did to the convoy. And I'm just so glad that so many Canadians were eventually able to read past the media narratives and read past their algorithms to see that what he did was so brutish and so wrong and so anti-democracy, and such a lie, and the good thing about this is that I think I hope people will be much more skeptical of what they read in the media. There's a really big movement now to defund the CBC, which is also totally unprecedented. The CBC is our national broadcaster. It's our public broadcaster, sort of similar to the BBC in the UK. And I grew up listening to the CBC every morning. This was the soundtrack to my life, the CBC radio. When I was a kid, we didn't have cable. We had 2 channels. So I watched what was on the CBC, and it was pretty good. It was good quality Canadian. So, not super shiny. But it was good quality TV and good quality radio. And at some point in probably the last 10, 15 years, things changed and they became a propaganda outlet for woke ideology. And, I was on the CBC and I wrote for the CBC a number of times. And as soon as I started criticizing gender identity ideology, I was blacklisted. And I remember the first event that we ever did in Vancouver that was challenging gender identity ideology and discussing the impact on women's rights at the Vancouver Public Library, which we had to fight to hang on to that venue. They tried to cancel us, of course, and we got our lawyers with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms involved, and we managed to maintain the venue. The CBC is located literally right across the street from the Vancouver Public Library. And that morning, the morning of the event, they hosted a roundtable panel discussing whether or not Meghan Murphy might engage in hate speech at the event. They didn't include me in the panel. They have my number. They could have easily called me and asked me, "What are you planning to talk about tonight? Is it hate speech?" They didn't. And of course, they didn't bother to walk across the street to see what was being said. But they pretended to kind of report on it nonetheless as hate speech. So that's what the CBC has been up to. And I could never in my lifetime have imagined that people would support defunding the beloved CBC. But there's a big movement to support it. And, Pierre Poilievre has promised, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, who's very likely to win the next election and become Prime Minister of Canada, he has ran on a platform of defunding the CBC, and people support him in that. So that's quite interesting to me.
Remarkable things are afoot in Canada, as they are in many other countries in the Western world. And I think you're right. People need to get their info about these countries from somewhere other than the mainstream media. You've mentioned already that one of the signs of Trudeau's clownish and scary authoritarianism is that he's been very keen to control what Canadians see on the internet, what gets prioritized, what they can look at, what they're more likely to come across, what they're not allowed to see. I wanted to ask you about what that entailed exactly, because my understanding is that, there's Bill C-27, which lots of people will have heard of, which was one of his efforts to maintain greater regulatory power over the internet or how it presents itself to Canadian citizens. But I understand there were other bills as well. Explain to us a little bit about how keen he was to control the internet and how that played out exactly.
Yeah, one of these bills that he was working very hard to pass was called the Online Harms Act, which was framed as, protecting, it was, primarily framed as protecting kids from predators online. This was Bill C-63. But in truth, what it was really about was it was proposing to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to qualify online hate speech as discrimination. And if the bill passed, individuals would gain the ability to file anonymous complaints against it's just a freaking clown show, right? To file anonymous complaints against other Canadians for engaging in speech they consider to be hateful on social media. So, you would see something on Facebook that you don't like, you can file an anonymous complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal, and the individual that you're filing a complaint against theoretically can be dragged through this Human Rights Tribunal court process, and if found guilty, fined up to $50,000, be penalized with life in prison for hateful conduct, be sentenced to house arrest. I mean, not only is it a huge waste of time and resources, but it's also insane to allow individuals to run around the internet filing complaints about each other because they see things online that they find offensive. And, you know, it was interesting because part of the bill included the ability to file complaints based on, you know, the probability that a person might say something hateful in the future. So you could essentially accuse somebody of thought crime and potentially have them charged and prosecuted with thought crime if you think that they might say something hateful in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading about that at the time and thinking this is, you know, in some ways is even worse than thought crime. It's the idea of pre-crime, you know, punishing someone before they've actually done the thing you think they might do. I mean, it really is out of the kind of sci-fi book of authoritarianism. What do you think drove, because I think one of the commonalities across many Western nations over the past few years has been this desire amongst governments. We see it really strongly in Europe, this desire amongst governments to control what their citizens can see on the internet. So we've got an online safety bill in the UK that people are constantly talking about, which is about the harms that people might experience when they go online. There are lots of bills and laws in Europe which are similarly devoted to wiping away problematic material and making sure people have a very nice time every time they're on the internet. In the Canadian context, what do you think drove Trudeau's lust for controlling that flow of information? Was this about protecting his own rule? Was it really a crusade against dissent, even though it gets dressed up as a crusade against hate speech, of course?
I think that it was a crusade against dissent. I think that he's a true authoritarian and he doesn't want Canadian citizens to be allowed to criticize him. I don't think he supports democracy. I think that, again, he's protecting his ego. One of the things that I think you alluded to earlier that he did manage to pass was the Online Streaming Act, which empowered a government agency, the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Communications Commission, to filter what Canadians see on social media and on YouTube, for example. So that was, you know, what I was referencing earlier when I said Justin Trudeau gets to control the internet. It was, you know, that bill in particular, because it's been coming down the pike for several years now before they actually passed it, you know, was one of the reasons why I left Canada. I left Canada because I was terrified about the COVID authoritarianism and the incoming vaccine mandates, and I was worried that I would get trapped there. But I also was worried, I think, legitimately that I would be prevented from working, and that I would be prosecuted for the work that I do, because all of the work that I do essentially is critical of Justin Trudeau and his government. And, you know, it was very clear that my YouTube account was censored because the content was critical of Justin Trudeau and his government, that I was sort of trapped in this no view zone that I couldn't escape from as soon as that bill passed, because he decided that I was, you know, I was a danger, I suppose, to his narratives and his aims. So it was really weird what happened, and it really had a very clear impact, I think, on the Canadian public, and again their view of what was happening in Canada and around the world. And you could tell, and it became even more obvious to me when I was outside Canada, because I talked to so many people, both in my work and in my real life, from around the world. And everyone would ask, you know, what the hell is going on in Canada? And people, again, they saw Justin Trudeau as a joke and an authoritarian. And in Canada, people thought everything was all good, and they thought that they had this incredible reputation and that people were all jealous of them, and everybody wished that they could live in Canada. And I was like, this is not true. This may have been true in the 90s where everyone thought, oh, Canada is so nice, so polite, so quaint. Wouldn't it be nice to live in Canada? That ended during COVID. And nobody knew it because the algorithms were altered in favor of the Canadian government. So that was a big one. And it certainly had an impact on my work.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. It's remarkable listening to you talk about Trudeau, because if this kind of stuff were to happen in a third world country, you know, a leader trying to control the internet, branding his critics as terrorists, invoking a state of emergency against people who protest against him. And if that happened anywhere else, our leaders would have no problem calling it tyranny. But because it was happening in Canada, you know, we didn't hear much of that criticism from leaders in Europe or leaders in the UK. So it is remarkable to have it spelt out in the way that you're spelling it out. One of the common themes of the West today, I think, and one of the more interesting themes in politics is the growing clash and the growing animus between, I guess, the ruling establishment and working class people. I mean, that exploded onto the public stage in Canada during the Freedom Convoy, during the truckers' protest, the extraordinary response of Trudeau to that, you know, the emergency acts, seizing the funds that these people raised so that they could fund their protests, a really tyrannical clampdown on working people. And we've seen it in Europe as well, with farmers rising up against net zero policies and people pushing back against severe economic downturn and our government's reliance on mass immigration to paper over the cracks of economic problems within our countries. All of that is happening, and it's definitely happening in Canada. So I wanted to ask you, what do working class people think of Trudeau now? And do they see him as a threat to their economic living conditions as well as to their way of life?
Yeah, I mean, I was thrilled when the trucker convoy organized, and I was quite shocked. I didn't think Canadians had it in them, to be honest. We're known as quite passive people, but I think that seeing a real working class uprising in Canada was inspiring, not just to all Canadians or many Canadians, the unsnobbish ones in any case, but to the whole world and to Americans. You know, I think that the trucker convoy saved all of America, not just Canada, from the mandates and the ongoing lockdowns. And the fact that Justin Trudeau was just so clearly enraged by this, and he responded by not just persecuting, but actually trying to prosecute a number of people who were involved. And I think, I mean, since then, he's never really gotten over that. The truckers won. And I think he's just been actively trying to recover power and punish Canadians ever since. The reason, you know, Canadians right now are in a terrible space. People can't afford to buy groceries. when I was back there this year in the spring and the summer and the fall, I was totally shocked. I mean, I wouldn't be able to afford to live there. I wouldn't be able to afford rent in Vancouver. I wouldn't be able to afford groceries in Vancouver. I wouldn't be able to afford gas. And it was very amusing to me to see a media headline from the Toronto Star, which is yet another propaganda outlet, announcing that Canadians were more wealthy than ever. I don't know which Canadians he's talking about. Perhaps the most wealthy in Canada are more wealthy than ever, but the rest of Canadians are suffering and they feel stuck. I mean, there's really nowhere to move. You're trapped in this situation where you're working to survive and you're working to pay your mortgage and to just scrape by, and you can't get out. And, that's the result of Trudeau and his policies and his inflation and his printing money and, handing out all this money during COVID, I think, so that he can essentially try to prevent a rebellion, which he failed to do. You lock everyone down, but you send them a bunch of money and you stick them in front of the internet with their Netflix and their Uber Eats and keep them happy. And a lot of people were happy with that. Like, a lot of people were, it was disappointing to see how many people were completely uninterested in freedom. But instead we're like, but everything's fine. I have all my stuff. That's what, a ton of my friends in Vancouver were like, it's all good, so what? Like, I've got my house, I've got all my things, I've got my food, I've got my, maybe my family there. I think the people who really suffered were the single people and people who were struggling with addiction and mental health and poverty and things like that. But he really had a lot of people tricked until the very end, and people saw the results of those policies and of what he did during COVID, which came back to bite everyone else in the ass. It did come back to bite him in the ass in his own way, but he's clinging to power till the very end. He's essentially avoided being voted out of power, which is disappointing because I think that it would have been much more satisfying to vote him out of power and much more humiliating for him. But it's also, it's impeding the democratic process. It's a pretty serious thing in my opinion.
Yeah, I feel your pain because it can be very nice to vote bad people out of power, and not being able to do that is a blow to one's democratic rights. One issue that I see on the internet a lot when people are complaining, when I see people complaining about Trudeau and complaining about where Canada has ended up, it often gets refracted through the issue of immigration. And I did want to ask you what's going on with that, because the way I understand it is that Trudeau loosened some of the vetting procedures around new arrivals. There have been more new arrivals. People are interpreting it as putting greater strain on already strained public resources in Canada. And this is another common theme of Western politics. There is this growing questioning of the idea that our nation should be so reliant on immigration to prop up the economy or whatever else. How is that? Is that a key part of the discussion? How big of an issue is it, do you think, in relation to people who have grown incredibly bored and even very irritated with Trudeau?
I think it is a big issue for people. And I think that what's happened in Canada is that he's opened the doors in particular to, single men coming in from Muslim countries. And, you understand that as well as anyone in the UK and in Europe more broadly, and what the implications of that are. And you can see, I just saw this video the other day, I think it was from New Year's Eve, of Granville Street, which is one of the, main drags in downtown Vancouver. And it was swarming with, thousands of men. There were no women on the street. They were, it's not just about racism, but, it's impossible to miss that it was swarming with thousands and thousands of immigrant men. And even other images in the media and online of lineups for job interviews, and the lineups are full of immigrant men. And it's not only a strain on the economy. These people are making more money than I make, and they're not working. You know, when they arrive in Canada, the money and the resources that are handed to them equate to more money, like notably more money than I make. And granted, you know, I'm a starving writer, but I think that's notable, more than I've ever made in Canada in my entire life. And I can't imagine that wouldn't anger a working class person in particular, which is, of course, how then, you know, upper and middle class people and progressives and the government and the media are able to frame working class people as a bunch of racist, ignorant bigots. But, you know, how could you not feel angry at having worked and struggled your whole life, and then to see these, you know, immigrants show up and be handed resources and income and housing and everything else under the sun for nothing. And then on top of that, put a strain on our resources. You know, our healthcare system is falling apart in Canada. Nobody in Canada that I know has a doctor. And so people are reliant on walk-in clinics and the emergency room. And you can't get into a walk-in clinic. I've talked to a ton of people in Canada about this. You have to show up first thing in the morning and wait in a line to maybe get an appointment. Maybe you won't. If you go to emergency, you wait 6 or 7 hours, sometimes more. There was a story in the media of a man who went to emergency and he waited for 6 or 7 hours. They told him that he wasn't dying, essentially, so he wasn't all that important, and he was going to have to wait longer to get, you know, a more detailed checkup. And he didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted to go home. Fair enough. He went home and then died. And, you know, we've excused all sorts of nonsense in Canada. And, you know, overtaxing, and the fact, again, that people can't afford basics and can't afford to live, and certainly can't afford to thrive, you know, to buy a home in Canada because of our healthcare system. Like, well, at least we have free healthcare. But who cares? Who cares if you have free healthcare if you can't access healthcare? You can't get in to see a doctor. I mean, how is that helpful? You can go wait at emergency for 7 hours. If you have the flu, if you need antibiotics, it's a joke. And on top of that, you know, they're making it ever more easy, I suppose, to access medically assisted death. So, you know, they're replacing a healthcare system. This is what it can be read as in any case. They're replacing a healthcare system with medically assisted suicide, which is a lot cheaper than providing people with actual healthcare. It's just there's no good trade-off anymore for Canadians.
Yeah, there is a dystopian feel to late stage Trudeau Canada, and I think that the medically assisted death discussion really highlights that, when you read about Canadians being offered suicide or offered a way out from their often, you know, problems that are often caused by economic circumstances or social circumstances. It's quite terrifying to read about that stuff. I want to ask you, I mean, another big thing is happening in North America over the next couple of weeks. Not only has Trudeau announced his intention to resign, but also Donald Trump is going to take over in the United States and is going to be inaugurated in a couple of weeks. I wonder what impact you think that will have on Canada. So Trudeau's on his way out. Trump is on his way back in. He's already doing a lot of, I guess you could call it, political shitposting by saying that Canada will become the 51st state and we're going to go and take it over. And that's causing a lot of laughs and a little bit of concern amongst some people. What impact do you think the second administration of Donald Trump will have on Canada? And I guess Canada's willingness, or Canadians' willingness, to talk about some of these problems of wokeness and so on in a bit more of an open way?
I mean, I think the impact of the Trump win has already been huge, in his words. Before he's even come into power officially, we've seen social media companies start to cave on their anti-free speech policies. We just saw Zuckerberg of Meta announcing that they were getting rid of their fact-checking mechanism. And, they were going to allow political posts in the algorithm. And I think now we're allowed to call people who are men who identify as women mentally ill. So that's so that's fun. I mean, I've been doing that for many years now. But of course, I've also been removed from Facebook's algorithm for some years now. I think that it's really amazing how quickly things shifted when people observed that, oh no, democracy actually does still work. And the people chose the non-establishment candidate who refused to play the game. And it's not, I don't necessarily love Trump as a person. It's not like I've ever loved his personality. I'm like sort of irked by a lot of things that he says. But at the same time, it's been so thrilling to watch everyone who's been suppressed and insulted and marginalized for so many years by the Democrats and their media and these urban elites rise up and essentially be able to give all of those people, to give the elites a big FU. And Canada has followed. I think that the political shift in Canada that's coming, which again is a Conservative Party win, led by Pierre Poilievre, it's not just any Conservative Party that's going to win. It's Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party because he supported the convoy. He's an advocate of free speech. He's been a staunch opponent of Justin Trudeau and his policies. He's come out against gender identity ideology, which is huge because he didn't do that for a long time. And we were all sort of waiting for him to take a stand on that, which is, it's a really important issue to a lot of Canadians. Never mind that he's attempting to address the problem of inflation and the fact that, Canadians can't afford to buy meat and eggs. But I think that everyone's been emboldened. We feel like, okay, democracy does still work. Thank God. I didn't know if it still did. I didn't know what was going to happen in the US election. I certainly thought that Trump was the most popular candidate, but I didn't trust the system to pull through, and it did. And that's empowering to the people. That's what democracy is for. It's to empower the people. And I think that the authoritarians and the elites hadn't realized, or they had forgotten that. They'd forgotten that America is still a democracy. Canada is still a democracy. And we, the people, have the power to change things. I think Canadians had forgotten that they actually had the power if they stood together to affect change, and they did affect change. And I don't think that, or I hope that people, these kinds of politicians and the media aren't going to get away with what they've been getting away with for so long. The media outlets in Canada that have been controlling the narrative, not just the CBC, but they're falling apart. Trudeau's had to give them, hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants so that they can survive, because no one is interested in reading propaganda. And they know that it's propaganda. They know that it's BS. And so I suppose I hope that Canadians won't become complacent again. I hope that they won't forget what happened. And I hope that they'll remember that if they hand over their freedoms, it's possible that they won't be able to get them back, and that, comfort and safety is not a fair trade-off for losing their rights and freedoms. So I'm certainly going to do my part to keep reminding people of this forever and ever and ever. And I hope that Trudeau is remembered for all of eternity as the worst prime minister and the most hated prime minister in all of Canadian history. And, beware of the male feminist.
Meghan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.